Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center, and today's discussion will focus on social policy responses in Latin America and the Caribbean. Around the world, as we all know, the economic impacts of the coronavirus have been devastating. They have been just as devastating in this region of the world. Quarantines are in place in most countries, and economic activity has all but ground to a halt. The rise in unemployment has been dramatic, and especially hard hit are those who are in the informal sector, which on average across Latin America and the Caribbean are over half of the labor force. Countries that have already been struggling with low rates of growth face a deep and possibly historic level of recession. Just this week, the IMF released a report that predicted a negative growth rate in 2020 for the region of 5.6%, which is almost double the contraction in the rest of the world. So our questions today have to do with what are governments doing to support people who have lost their sources of income. Even before the impacts of the coronavirus, for example, people in the informal sector lacked access to health insurance, to pensions, and other forms of social protection. 14 countries of the region are now asking the International Monetary Fund for $4.5 billion in new loans and credits. But what are the long-term implications of financing these expansionary social policies with added debt, given the existing high debt to GDP ratios? How, if at all, during this economic freefall, can revenues be raised domestically? And finally, in the realm of politics, in light of last year's protest movements in many countries of the region, what are the political consequences of not doing enough to address the rise in hardship and poverty during as well as after the pandemic? We have a truly outstanding group of experts and friends to help sort through these questions about what is being done and what can be done. First up will be Nora Lustig. She is the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics at Tulane University and director of Tulane's Commitment to Equity Institute. Sebastián Villarreal, who joins us from Santiago, Chile, is Undersecretary for Social Services in Chile's Ministry of Social Development and Family. He is the former director in Chile and in the United States of America Solidaria, an anti-poverty nonprofit organization. Luis Miguel Castilla is the former finance minister of Peru and has served for many years as a senior official in the Latin American Development Bank, the CAF, as well as the Inter-American Development Bank. He is currently a senior consultant in Lima, Peru. And finally, Santiago Levy is non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the former vice president for sectors and knowledge of the Inter-American Development Bank. Santiago recently authored a paper requested by the United Nations Development Program, which is titled Suggestions for an Emergency. Thank you again for joining us. If those who are joining us on the webcast wish to ask a question of one of the speakers, please send a tweet. Please contact our Twitter account at LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG, and we will be happy to take your questions and direct them. Nora, please go ahead.
Cindy, let me start by thanking you and the Latin American program at the Wilson Center for giving an opportunity to discuss something as important as social policy in the current context. As you said, we have to start with a warning that we are facing a dire situation and with lots of uncertainty because we don't know really what the virus will do to us in the coming month or years. Therefore, I think that one of your questions was, what to do about that, in the long run. I think we first have to make it to the long run, and I think we have to put all our emphasis in achieving that because I think that we are facing extraordinary challenges that require very decisive actions that in the short term may seem that will have long-term consequences that are very daunting, but are needed to be taken. There's a lot of discussion about how much the region can undertake countercyclical policies, both on the fiscal and the monetary side. I don't know if Santiago or Castilla, Luis Miguel will comment on that. But I think that at this point, we have to remember always that what credit rating agencies worry about and investors is both the numerator and the denominator. So you may increase debt by less, but if that results in a lower GDP level, then what you're going to end up having is something worse than what you wanted in the first place. And I think we have to do whatever it takes to contain the fall in GDP as much as possible. It's not unheard of, as it happened in the 1980s, that often policies that were undertaken by the region resulted in over-adjustment and were counterproductive, and I think we have to avoid that now as well. Second thing I want to say is that we need to abide by a new principle, which is now imperative, not just because of ethical considerations, but also because of what the pandemic implies. And I call it the universal social inclusion. It's now imperative because if you don't include anybody, then the ability to actually contain the COVID-19 and also avoid its resurgence is going to be jeopardized. And so it's not just wishful thinking or an ethical principle, but if we leave outside people because of legal considerations or because of social prejudice, we'll pay very dearly. The third thing I want to say is that resources will have to come from everywhere. Obviously the multilateral organizations, governments, but also philanthropy, wealthy individuals, and like I say to everybody now, you and me, especially those of us who are lucky enough to continue having a steady stream of income, while a lot of the people in the world now don't. Having said that, now let me say a few things about the impact on the poor and vulnerable. What we're seeing is that even though the disease didn't start with them, it's hitting them very hard. It's hitting very hard in the US. Disproportionately hard are hit people who are in low-income settings and in minorities. And I think we're going to see something similar in countries in our region. And even though demographically our region seems younger, I think that if you control for the health status of people, we're probably going to see a lot of death as well, and concentrated among those who are most vulnerable. It's also going to be pretty devastating in terms of what happens to the poorest and the most vulnerable in terms of income, what they will endure in the short term, and also in terms of the medium term, instead in the form of undernutrition, lost ability to learn, and other forms of human capital that are being depleted as we speak, is going to be very tough. As you said, most of the region is, 50% of the labor force is informal, but among the poor, 80% are in the informal sector, and they live primarily in urban areas. 2/3 of the poor are in urban areas, and lots of them live in slums, which make everything more challenging. So what policies have the countries been implemented, and which ones should we think should be emphasized probably more? And let me say that here I want to go beyond income. It's not only income that we're trying to protect, we're also trying to protect accumulation in human capital and prevent dysfunctional behaviors from becoming widespread. In particularly, we're very concerned with what's been happening in terms of domestic violence, particularly against women. So first and foremost, if you're worried about income, obviously the typical policy that people are implementing throughout is the increase of cash transfers in two ways: increasing the coverage, and also in countries that are able to, they're also increasing the size of those cash transfers, and that's absolutely necessary. There are also some ideas that I think probably have been explored less, which is the introduction of emergency employment programs, because although there's a lot of low-skilled jobs that they're disappearing as we speak, there's also demand for low-skilled jobs that arise as a result of the health crisis. And that probably creates some opportunities for hiring people that are being displaced from the other sectors. I think that also we need to focus very carefully in terms of how to help people endure quarantine and observe the recommendations that are required to prevent contagion. In particular, as we know, the access to water is essential. Access to soap and other forms of sanitation is essential. And in many parts of the poor neighborhoods in our region, access to water is still very, is not present. So therefore, there's going to have to be policies targeted to generating access to water in whichever way you can in the short term, and also address that problem in the medium term more forcefully. The other thing that's very important is how are you going to continue to support educational services for the poor and vulnerable, especially because they may not have the luxury of access to internet, wherever that is feasible. Of course, people are making use of that, but since that's not a done deal, and even if they have access to internet, maybe through a phone, not necessarily through a laptop or a tablet. So we have very severe limitations for those groups in order for them to continue to have access to education, and the educational gap may increase. There's some suggestions that you could use sort of more traditional ways of accessing education through TV and radio, which are more widespread among the poor than anything that has to do with the new technologies. Regarding domestic violence, I think that what we need to do is rely very heavily on the existing platforms that are in some countries have introduced platforms using technology, but also there's quite a bit of supportive networks, local supportive networks that have been relied upon to help prevention and also response to domestic violence. But that needs to be increased drastically, because as you probably have heard, the reporting of increases in domestic violence throughout is alarming. And this is something that can have scar tissues that will last very long. Another group that I think we need to be aware of is the undocumented migrants, that in many countries do not necessarily have access to health services, and they definitely, most countries don't have access to the safety net programs. If you leave them out, that's going to be a problem. Like I said, we need universal social inclusion, because those groups are also going to be affected by the virus, and therefore they have to be protected. Let me say that, as two sort of conclusions in terms of what, after we're writing a paper, by the way, with Mariano Tomasi at the Universidad de San Andres about how to, what would be sort of a series of recommendations to actually protect the poorest and most vulnerable in the region. And I think, if I would conclude with two main recommendations, one is that it's very important to think about beyond income and beyond government actors. So to rely very heavily on local organizations is going to be crucial in order to help the poor and the vulnerable. And the second thing is that if you're going to emphasize one particular investment in this period and beyond, in one particular area in which you want all the forces to intervene with the same objective, would be to really close the digital divide. With the issue of having to have distance, physical distance, as a key to fight the virus, then anything that we can do in the digital space becomes incredibly important to actually deal with the disease and also protect the most vulnerable. And let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next, I'd like to welcome Sebastián Villarreal from Santiago. Sebastián will have to leave us a little bit early. He has, as you know, very important duties within the Chilean government. So if you have a question for Sebastián, please let us know so we can make sure to get that in before he has to jump off. Thank you. So, please go ahead, Sebastián.
Okay, good morning to the panel and all participants on the webcast. I would like to thank you, Cindy, and the Wilson Center for inviting me to present what we had been doing in Chile during this COVID-19 pandemic. During my 7 minutes explanation, I will talk about three main topics. First, a general scenario of COVID-19 in Chile. Secondly, an explanation of the economic measures that we have implemented. And thirdly, the main social policy measures led by the President Piñera. So Just one moment, please. And okay. So to start, I would like to share some of the main metrics about COVID-19 in our country, and I would like to highlight the total test and the number and tests per 1 million people, which I believe with a strong quarantine, and also this measure is probably one of the reasons that has helped Chile to flatten the COVID-19 curve. So here, as you can see, until April 14th, we have more than 7,900 confirmed cases, 92 deaths, unfortunately, and mostly of them, 76% are people are elderly, and we have recovered more than 2,600 people, based in our Chilean Health Ministry report. And as you can see in the other part of the slide, you can see the different scenario of total cases, total deaths, number of total tests based in the World Matters info of COVID-19. In terms of our emergency economy plan, the government had designed 17 billion in order to protect families, workers, and companies, especially small and medium-sized businesses, due to the economic impact of COVID-19 in the country. As you can see, there is also 2 billion invest protect around 2.6 million workers who are not part of the formal labor market. And this includes the direct transfer of social benefits and the creation of emergency jobs plan. Third, you see 10.5 million from budget relocation to help 181 nursing homes and more than 7 elders without a support network belonging of the 40% of the poorest population in our country. Let's see in other government measures we have implemented a number of actions to protect the economy effect of this pandemic we'll have in our low-income population. So let's start with the income protection plan. So as you can see, we have a creation of a 5 million emergency fund, which 2 million of those come from fiscal budget relocation. That is less than 0.8 of our GDP, in order to protect basically the income of those who are most vulnerable. The use of this fund will be flexible depending on the needs required in order to give an adequate response to the evolution of this sanitary crisis. Second, this Employment Protection Act to protect 4.7 million workers, and this measure in particular allows them to access to the unemployment benefit and specific circumstances response to the evolution of also to the sanitary crisis based on force measure. Also, you have the postponing real estate tax, that there are very specific measures for people with real estate property appreciated almost $160,000 or less. And finally, in terms of this measure, the relief measure for low-income people and small businesses that have debts with the state. As a third point, I would like to highlight the social policy implemented by our ministry. So here you will see the COVID-19 subsidy bond, which is basically a monetary payment to more than 1.5 million beneficiaries who are part of our most vulnerable families according to their socioeconomic qualification in the Chilean Social Registry of Household. And this require a government investment of around 130 million. I don't want to go forward with which are the beneficiaries, but as I told you, we focus that in the low-income population, and they give an amount given to the beneficiary of around $60 per each dependent family member. This payment is one-time subsidy, but a second subsidy has not been rolled out in case of economic and public crisis worsens. Some specific measures for vulnerable groups that part of our arena are the protection of the elderly and also for the homeless people. So I would like to highlight here, given that older people, as probably we all know, are one of the most vulnerable age group to COVID-19, the Chilean government has taken into action diverse ranges of measures for their protection. So let's take very fast some of them, based on the actions that our national agency of older persons are doing. First, emotional contained phone numbers. This is really a very neat action for elders who require emotional contention and psychological support due to the isolation and quarantine. Also volunteer work, given that many elders are in quarantine and they cannot leave their homes. We put them in contact with volunteers to do grocery or medical shopping and run personal errands for them. Also, a national campaign we call Count on Me, which is oriented to the general public that promote the support of elders in local communities by helping them with grocery and medical shopping and other give isolation. Also, and this is a very strong measure, the quarantine for nursing home. This is a mandatory quarantine for the 947 authorized nursing homes in our country. So more than 20,000 elderly live today in these establishments, and around 18,000 people work there. So this is a very strong measure to protect also the health of the elderly. Also, a strong influenza vaccination, as you probably know, here in Chile and in the south of the Americas, we are facing the winter time. So we need to anticipate this influenza vaccination in order to avoid multiple simultaneous viruses at the once. You know, now we have COVID-19, but we know that in a few weeks we have also influenza, and that combination could be a real little weapon for this specific vulnerable group in our country. So we are providing free vaccination for all the vulnerable population. Also, a strong protocols. Jointly with the Health Ministry, we have elaborated different protocols to prevent and spread of the virus among this group. And finally, and very important, to provide personal protection devices, isolation spaces, and replacement workers in retired homes. And regarding the measure of homeless people, we have developed an emergency COVID-19 action plan. We call Plan Protege Calle, where we have also we have elaborated and implemented strong protocols for all shelters in the country, and mass vaccination for all the homeless people, and not only for the homeless people, but also for those people who work directly with them in the shelters and roads. Third, we create an advisory committee with relevant NGOs, the central government, academia, local governments, and the private sector to try to find together a collaborative solutions to enhance this pandemic. Also, basically, we are moving the beginning of our winter program for the homeless from May 18 to mid-April. So we are now, today, in fact, the president will announce the launch of our winter program, which is 1 month before a regular year. Also, the installation of 182 24-hour shelters with a capacity of more than 3,300 beds, primary, again, for the elderly and the chronically ill homeless population. 80 roads that will attend around 4,000 people per day, doubling last year's impact, and also 10 medical routes to attend the sanitary need of the homeless population. So these are basically very specific measures in terms of economic and social that we have been implemented. And because today we are facing, as all the countries in the Americas, a big challenge. And we basically believe, and we know that if the states work alone, they will not be able to make it. And we are running a very strong invitation for different actors, private sector, nonprofit organizations, the academia, to work together to implement all this measure and to really protect the health and the life for the most vulnerable people in our country.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I think we've all seen in the past that Chile has one of the strongest capabilities for responding with these countercyclical measures. And I think the measures that you detailed certainly illustrate that. We'll now turn to Miguel Castilla, who joins us from Lima. Miguel.
Hi, Cindy. Good morning to you all. First, let me thank the Wilson Center and the Latin American Program for this conversation. And it's a privilege to be able to see you all, my good friends from all over the place. So I'd like to basically do a little mention three things, ideas in my time, in my 7 minutes, beginning with the fact that our baseline is a very complicated one. So Cindy mentioned that we're going to having a strong GDP, contraction this year in Latin America, but we begin from a baseline of very stagnant growth conditions. Growth has been very muted in the region for the past 5 years. That we add the fact that macroeconomic fundamentals in the region are much weaker today than they were a decade ago when we had to face the global financial crisis. And this has led, the weaker growth has led to a lot of social, unrest, as I think Cindy alluded in her introduction. So with that, in mind as a baseline, I would mention three things that I think are quite important, and I think for the analysts and particularly in the focus on the priorities of governments and policymakers. So one is discussing social policies. In this particular crisis, social has to go hand in hand with labor policies, because one of the main concerns and worries after the health pandemic is contained, we don't know when this will happen, but a lot of people lose their jobs. So in my home country, in Peru, there is some estimates that 1 in 4 Peruvians can lose their jobs, and in a very fragile labor market, 7 out of 10 workers are informal. So that's critical when we are thinking about social policies, is how to preserve jobs. So the government in Peru has pursued, along with other countries, countercyclical fiscal policies. We've just heard from our colleague in Chile, and we've been able to do that because we've been able to actually maintain sound macroeconomic fundamentals. In the case of Peru, there is fiscal space to actually pursue a very aggressive stimulus program, 12% of GDP. It's not all fiscal, about half of it is fiscal, but this is to the extent that other industrialized countries are doing. So here, obviously, the focus, as was mentioned by Nora, is focused on poor, but the government is reaching about half of the households in the country, of all the poor ones, or most of the poor ones. But here there's a key question. How do we reach out with those tools of cash transfers to the informal workers, or the people that are not in the databases of the social ministries, to be able to target them? So here we have an idea of lack of relevant and effective tools to reach that pool of very vulnerable populations. So that's one idea in terms of keeping jobs. The other one is how to avoid massive bankruptcies of law firms, particularly small and medium-sized firms that are facing really a crunch of having no income and having to pay their payrolls. And this is where the government has been able to use all sorts of policies to be able to add liquidity, even very controversial measures such as tapping into pension funds, into long-term savings to be able to give liquidity to workers. There is this whole discussion about this. So this is one important issue. Labor and social go hand in hand in this particular crisis. The second idea has been health. Because this is the healthcare wrongs is fundamental, and the quarantines that we're actually facing most countries very, very costly economically. Of course, human life comes first, but one of the reasons behind the quarantine, at least in the case of my, has been the fact that the healthcare answer is insufficient. Governments have been trying to gain time to be able to build that capacity to cater to build the healthcare attention to cater to the sick. Just one clear example, which is quite telling, is the number of ICU beds that we have available. In Peru, we have one ICU bed per 1,000 inhabitants, in comparison to 30 in the US or France or Europe. So there is really a gap to be filled to be able to respond appropriately to this crisis. And this is in spite of countries that have been able to spend a lot of money. For instance, Brazil has, is the country with the largest and perhaps more sophisticated healthcare system in Latin America. It spends 4% of its GDP in comparison to 10 in France, for instance. So it's an issue of spending more in this case, and actually tapping into what Nora was saying, adding new technologies to be able to make more effective and efficient healthcare, delivery. So there's this smart healthcare initiatives. This is an opportunity to be able to actually rethink giving appropriate healthcare in normal times, and in particular having the capacity to address emergencies when they arise. The third aspect, and I'm running out of time, it is how we finance all of this. Because as I mentioned, countries are facing really very, very muted growth before the crisis and now a recession. And we have the issue of informality, which I'm sure that Santiago, who's a world expert, will address the issues of safety nets and informality. But there's this in which most countries don't have of actually financing all of this with existing resources. Public savings are low, access to markets is gone for most countries, and we're all trying to finance from multilaterals. So here multilaterals, like my former employees in Washington, have a chance to actually make a difference. But they more or less allocate around $3 billion of approvals each year to Latin America. 30 billion is very little in comparison to all the needs, and concessional resources are going to be quite scarce. So let me end with this. Those are the issues that we need. One is labor market interventions to preserve jobs. This comes from preserving, firms function appropriately, dealing with healthcare, capacities to address crisis. And here, this is quite telling what we're seeing in countries such as China and others. How you finance all of this. And there's some talks about increasing taxes for the rich, which may actually come to discussion in terms of tax forms. But the last message, and I would like to end with this, Cindy and colleagues, is the fact that this crisis has really put in center stage the fragility of our safety nets. Our nets are quite fragile. They're not sustainable. In Peru, for instance, 1 in 4 inhabitants have access to an appropriate pension. And so this, and the fact that we have 70% informality, and I think the informality will increase, is a very, very important item in the agenda of reforms that need to be put in place. And we're talking about safety nets, and we're talking about having universal income facilities for all, as Nora was alluding to. We need to talk about tax reform. There's no way that we can actually confront this post-coronavirus world without thinking about the new consensus. What needs to be, what's the effort to actually put taxes, increase our tax burden, which is very complicated if you have an informal economy, but it's really, really paramount to be able to build resilient economies and sound safety nets. And with this, I'll stop, Cindy. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Miguel's comments make me think of my first question for Nora, which will have to do with the income of the impact of taxation on decreasing inequality in Latin America and what more can be done, and we'll come back to you. But I'd also like Sebastián and Miguel to be thinking about the political impacts in their countries of this sudden collapse of economies and the greater hardship that's been inflicted on the populations. How do people in general evaluate the response of the government? Have approval ratings gone up? What are the long-term political implications? But we'll come back to those issues. Santiago Levy.
Am I muted? Is it okay? So good morning, and thank you to Cynthia for inviting me, and happy to be with good old friends. So I want to begin by highlighting what is a very different dimension of this crisis compared to crises that Latin America has had in the past. This is first and foremost a health crisis. And it provokes an economic crisis as part of the solution. But until the health crisis is controlled, the economic crisis will continue. So the most essential aspect right now is to control the pandemic. And even if you were not concerned about income distribution, and even if you were not concerned about poverty, and I'm not saying that should not, but even if you had the coldest heart in the world, and you were not concerned about income distribution and poverty, you must, in this particular crisis, ensure that there are income transfers to workers, particularly in the informal sector. The state cannot tell a worker, stay home, without at the same time providing him with some means and support while that person's staying home. An informal worker, given the choice of a probability of getting sick and infected versus the certainty of having hardship at home because they have no income, will actually go to work. So the quarantine is being very imperfectly enforced in some countries because those countries are not providing informal workers with means of support. So strictly from the health perspective, it is urgent. Task number one from the economic point of view is make income transfers to informal workers to facilitate to them that they can stay at home for the 6 weeks, 2 months, or whatever period of time is going to be required for the quarantine to be put under control. Peru has made a great effort, and I think Miguel should be proud of what the Peruvians are doing. Brazil is making a large effort. Brazil has set up a website in which people can actually enroll, claim that they're informal workers, and they're actually getting transfers already. So no particular mean is going to be perfect. Miguel mentioned correctly that we don't have the tools, but we're here today and we have to use whatever imperfect tools there are. There are registries of remittances, there are registries of health sectors, there are imperfect sets of registries, and with that, countries need to urgently begin to transfer income to informal workers because, point number two, we don't know how long this pandemic is going to last. Countries are beginning to struggle with the exit, but it is not clear whether that's going to be a gradual process. It is not clear whether people are acquiring or not acquiring immunity as a result of this virus, and it is not clear whether there might not be a spike again, which might require further guarantees. Now, down the road, people will have exhausted their savings, they will have exhausted any means of support, and you need to have a mechanism to transfer income to those people because in 3 or 4 months from now, we honestly don't know what is going to be happening. So I want to close this first important point is by whatever imperfect mechanism there is, states in Latin America must urgently transfer income to informal workers. This can be complemented by the sort of initiatives that Nora was speaking about, bringing civil society and other people, but the states cannot tell people, stay home and starve, because that's not just acceptable. A lot of people will say, look, there's no fiscal space to do that. The second point I want to make is, I think there's a confusion between the need for compensating measures and income transfers, and whether those measures are financed either by reallocating current spending or increasing spending or raising taxes. When people speak about countercyclical space, they're thinking about space to increase spending. And you may or may not have it depending on which country in Latin America is there. Peru is a country that does quite a bit of space. Other countries don't have that much space. Ecuador is perhaps the example of the other extreme. But regardless of whether you can increase spending or not increase spending, you have to do these compensating measures. And if you cannot increase spending, then you must either do them by changing the composition of whatever you're spending right now, or, unfortunately, putting taxes. It's not ideal from the point of view of the macroeconomy because it will lengthen the recession, but it's even less ideal and extremely inequitable to leave people who have nothing to do with this crisis, for which this is a completely exogenous shock, zero moral hazard, zero responsibility, to receive a huge shock to their lifestyles and to their income levels. So the discussion about fiscal space and countercyclical spending needs to be separated from the discussion, do we compensate the poor and do we compensate informal workers for the hardships that they're being suffering and that are being imposed on them as a result of the sanitary measures that are there. We're asking them to sacrifice, we're asking them not to go to work, we're asking them to stay at home, but we're not providing them with the means to be able to do that. States cannot do that. So hopefully in the days ahead, this message will permeate, and countries that have not done so far will put these measures together. A lot of the measures that have been put are to defend formal employment, and this is well and good. And this is really important, because one thing that we've learned from previous crises in Latin America is that whenever you have large bankruptcies of firms, the recovery is going to be much longer. But the amount of money that are being allocated to credit guarantees and to tax deferrals relative to the amounts of money that are being allocated to transfer income to informal workers and to poor workers are just not right. And we're going to come out of here with a lot more inequality and a lot more poverty and a lot more hardship. So I want to leave some space for the questions. That's kind of sort of the big point that I wanted to make in social protection. You have to think about it in the context of a health crisis and not in the usual context of the crisis. And you've got to separate that from the discussion of countercyclical spending and fiscal space. Thank you, Cynthia.
Santiago, thanks so much for those comments and for the clarity of the message. Sebastian is going to have to leave for a meeting. I think the rest of us on the screen are teleworking. He's very much engaged in real time in actual duties in the government. But I do want to ask you, Seba, if you could reflect on how the measures that you laid out in such detail have been perceived by the Chilean public as sufficient, as insufficient, and what impact those perceptions could have going forward on what we know were very violent as well as massive protest movements in Chile at the end of 2019. And thank you for being on for a few minutes to help us understand that issue.
Okay, before to leave, thank you again, Cindy, for the invitation. And as you mentioned, before this pandemic in our country, we need to, we have a very strong social movement and a big challenge, you know, in order to achieve and to implement different social and economic measures. Now, it's very difficult to predict, I mean, what will happen in our country after COVID-19, you know. But we know, and we have certainly about one strong scenario. Of course, the effect of this in our economy, in our low-income population, will be enormous, as the same in the world. What we have been seeing is that all these measures that we had been implemented had been very good received by the country. If we compare the approval of the government, you know, before, I mean, during the social crisis and now during the pandemic, we're moving up. So that means that the people, the population good receive the measure that we have been implemented. And I think something that we learn of what we had been facing during this social movement in October is that now we need to really put urgency to implement all this measure that I have been described, but also be prepared and anticipate of what will happen after the pandemic. You know, and now we have to, our focus is to control the pandemic, control the effects in specifically in the most vulnerable population. But we know that after the pandemic, we have a strong challenge in order to implement and to have measures who really go not only to the informal people, also to our medium class, which are always the people who not receive any kind of support from the state, and they now need also to have a kind of solution to achieve the different challenges in terms of income, food, and different aspects. So we are working hard. We are working with a lot of urgency sense, and we are glad that after a strong call to different areas of the country, the private sector had been very involved and put a lot of investment to complement the measure that had been led by the president, also the nonprofit sector, the academia. So I think we are all working together in order to achieve this crisis, and we hope we'll be successful in order to really be able to implement effective measures for those people who most need.
Sebastian, thank you very much. There is one more.
Thank you. I apologize
I don't want to abuse your time. I really appreciate that. Let's see. I would remind people who are watching, if you do want to ask a question, that we're taking questions to our Twitter account at LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG, if you would like to direct a question to someone else. So let's say goodbye to Sebastian and thank him for joining us. I'd like to mention that several people, have emphasized, especially Santiago, the role of the informal sector and the need to provide support, to small and medium sized enterprises. At some point in the near future, we'll also be looking at large companies in Latin America who are actually some of the largest employers, and their role in responding to this crisis and the kinds of supports that they need to be able to get back into operation and resume employment, for their labor force. Miguel, I'd like to ask you, before going back to Nora and Santiago, how this has played politically in Peru. You mentioned the enormous gaps, as well as some of the added cushion that Peru does have to respond. So I was wondering if you could reflect on the perceptions of the government and the potential impact in the future on politics.
Sure, Cindy. That's very important, because I think a lot of the implementation and a lot of the impact of the different policies that are being pursued will hinge upon the politics side of the day. So what we've seen so far in Peru has been very active president leading, the country, 80% approval, because of very, a very strong communication strategy. Every single day he dedicates an hour and a half explaining in very, simple terms to population what he's doing and what the efforts are. But I think this, unfortunately, as given that we have no idea how long it's going to last, is going to start frustrating people. So we've already had, the quarantine has been extended twice, and now we're hoping that this will be the last extension. Because as Santiago mentioned quite correctly, people are not only getting very, very concerned, because they're starting to feel economic impact of being at home without being able to produce, without being able to sell their things. So this initial approval of and will actually could actually turn into discontent. This lasts beyond, and we have no idea when will this finish. And there's this expectations that will end soon. And the truth is that we have no idea because the testing is still, insufficient to be able to have a targeted, strategy to contain the pandemic. And in our case, we've been a country that has been so far a little bit, inoculated from the populism that we've seen in different other countries in the region. And that's, I think, one of the main risks that we're seeing is we are going into electoral cycle. There's going to be elections in a year, and we're seeing very hyperactive Congress that is actually not helping, the government's efforts. Just to give two examples, they are tapping into private pension funds. They decided to take 25% off stock of the whole pension fund system, the private pension fund system, without actually acknowledging the fact that the government was doing a more targeted approach to actually give liquidity to the owners of those pension accounts. It has unilaterally, the Congress has enacted laws to really suspend all tolls, in roads. Now it's thinking about more sectoral interventions, and there's this growing fear of looking at a backlash and looking at culprits. And the private sector, big firms, are, I think, on sight of our politicians. So one of the fears that I have is that this discontent is real. People are starting to feel hunger and feel frustrated, and they cannot do their own thing. And the initial approval will turn around, hopefully not. But my main concern is having a very populist Congress that actually undermines the efforts that the government is taking. And so this is still playing. So this is a movie we haven't seen the end of. But I think most Latin Americans and Peruvians, we know the cost that populism impinge on society, particularly on the poorest segments of our people. So I would say my view is a little bit pessimistic, but let's hope that our politicians can rise to the occasion and learn from lessons from the past.
Thanks very much. I have a question for both Santiago and for Nora, but I also want to take some questions from the audience. Santiago, you made a very clear call for solving the health crisis by making it possible for people to stay home and basically providing subsidies. Where will that money come from? And it relates to an area that Nora has worked in a long time, which is how to make taxation systems more equitable, which means not only improving the progressivity of the tax system, relying less on the VAT and other measures, but also improving things on the spending side. So I want to talk a little bit more about where the funding is going to come from. One of you mentioned that the IDB has announced some funding, that it's not enough. People are going to the IMF, for huge amounts of loans, and we'll come back to that. But there are two questions to Santiago. One from Nora Lustig, who is the Vice President of Hemispheric and Global Affairs at the University of Miami, who wants to ask Santiago directly how he sees the situation in Mexico. And also a question from Jennifer Bognar at the Solidarity Center, labor organization, if I'm not mistaken, with the AFL-CIO, which is how can governments provide safely stipends to informal workers who don't have bank accounts so that they can receive these transfers or have access to the internet in order to register. So let's turn first to Santiago, and then we'll go to Nora. And please continue to send questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the questions. So where will the money come from? In different countries from different sources. For the smaller countries, the support from multilateral banks might be relevant, thinking of countries in Central America, in which the capabilities of the IDB and the World Bank are meaningful from the budgetary point of view. For some other countries, that's not really relevant. For Brazil, for Mexico, for Colombia, the money that can be borrowed from the World Bank and from the IDB, it's really not relevant in this particular context. In those countries, it might be that they actually phase out some other government spending, infrastructure projects, transportation projects, other projects are canceled, and you release space from the budget. In some other countries, you might be able to increase spending because you actually can borrow in the domestic capital market. Some countries can actually issue in the international capital markets. Panama placed a bond for $2.4 billion about 10 days ago. And some other countries that are in very dire situations might have to actually increase taxes on higher income households to finance this. So it's going to be a mix, different countries from different levels. But the fact that there's constraints, in my view, should not be the reason not to do them. On the second question on the situation in Mexico, I'm concerned because I think that the reaction in terms of providing households for means of support to be able to comply with the quarantine has been very, very slow in coming. And time is really upon us. So that should be accelerated to the extent possible. I don't know whether Nora wants to compliment. She probably has her own sense on this too as well. But
right. Before we leave you though, Santiago, if you could respond with a view of how you see things in Mexico specifically.
Mexico is going to be very badly hit. In the report released by the IMF yesterday, there are 2 countries in Latin America that for different reasons are going to suffer the most, according to their calculations. One is Ecuador, which already was in an IMF program before this crisis started, which is a country that cannot devalue because it has dollarized, and that reduces the capabilities to adjust. So Ecuador is going to be very badly hurt. But Mexico is going to be suffering very badly as well because the price of oil hurts it, because tourism hurts it, because Mexico is very tied to the US economy, and the fall in the US economy is going to bring Mexico down. And because paradoxically, Mexico is a large exporter of manufacturers, and the breakdown of the value chains is actually going to hit Mexico again through channels that are not going to be felt in other countries of Latin America. So the prediction of the IMF, and their number is as good as anybody's number, is for a fall of GDP of 6.6%. This is higher than was in the crisis of 94, 95. So it's a very complicated situation. And it has not been helped by the fact that the response in terms of measures, both to protect households and to protect formal sector jobs, has been fairly slow.
Great, thanks very much. Nora, I'm going to turn to you, but I'm going to add to the question that I was asked before about how to improve the fiscal balances of countries on both the revenue and the spending side, with a specific question to you from Hugo Noepino, who is the former president, as you probably know, of the central bank in Honduras, the former minister of finance, who asks about how you see Central American countries facing this tremendous challenge. Countries, as we know, with high levels of violence, great deal of migration, and even weaker economic cushions in most respects. Nora.
I also wanted to comment on something that it's important to note is that Argentina has been doing quite well in terms of its response, given all the constraints. And I see that it's not often mentioned that, and I think it should be mentioned because what's very interesting is that at this point, there's a lot of statesmanship shown by Fernandez, and he's been able actually to get support from the opposition as well. In terms of the actions that are being taken. So I think, you know, if you're going to choose examples in the region, I would invite your program to actually feature what Argentina is doing under very, very severe constraints. Peru and Chile have much more laxitude. The second thing I want to say is I'm not an expert on Central America. I mean, I think you should speak about Central America, so I'm going to ask Cindy to invite you in the coming weeks to talk about Central America. But what I worry a lot about Central America is, yes, violence, etc., and As we know, some of the countries have an exclusionary policy that dates centuries, like Guatemala, that has very little fiscal resources to address anything, and where the indigenous population is so large. I don't know what's going to happen in countries like that, and I worry deeply about the consequences. I want to say something about taxes, Cindy, and you're going to probably be surprised, but I don't think this is the time to speak about raising taxes. I think what you want to do, I mean, I think we really need to think about out of the box. We're in a very unusual situation. And I want to also comment on what Santiago said about this is a self-inflicted crisis because we are actually asking people to stay home. I am not sure whether if we leave the virus to sort of go freely, whether eventually the economic crisis wouldn't be worse, because we don't know yet how many people would be sick. And therefore, what we're doing now may seem there is a trade-off, but maybe there isn't one if we look a little bit beyond. So we're facing something that it's very, very tough to deal with. And at this point, I wouldn't try to sort of introduce a tax reform. I would really invite the private sector to contribute in whichever way it can, both through the companies that are doing well, because there are some companies who are doing well, and both through their own pockets. Particularly, there are very wealthy individuals in Latin America, as we know, and we need them now to contribute like Jack Dorsey did from Twitter, $1 billion for the COVID fight, and that's about 30% of his net worth. We need actions that go well beyond what the tax reform would achieve right now. Because I think that, as I said, the digital divide at this point is vital to be eliminated, because that's going to solve a lot of other issues, including, finding a safe way of sending people money to, that was asked by one of the people who sent you a question earlier. I think we need to really focus on closing that divide, and many of our wealthy individuals in Latin America actually made their wealth from that sector. So it's time to give back. And so I would not really focus on fiscal reform right now. That may be very hard to actually pass. I think that right now we want to think about how the resources that people have from different, even companies that can donate maybe data, cell phones to poor people so that they can actually have access to information, and also ways to defend themselves, and ways to learn, and ways to actually have access to health care. I think I would ask him to do it that way. We'll come back to the fiscal, to the sort of more normal times, to the fiscal reform that's needed. But right now you need really actions that are out of the box. And I would ask everybody to think about them very seriously and commit resources to get us out of this and help the very poor. By the way, I want to second Santiago's emphasis on giving money to people to stay home, but not only to those who are at home, so also the homeless, the undocumented migrants, the trans. I mean, you have many people that are excluded from your radar screen if you just focus on workers and people who own small businesses. There's many others that you need to deal with in this pandemic, and that's why I said that one overriding principle is universal social inclusion.
Nora, thanks. We're out of time, but I feel impelled to share this one last question from Vanessa Orellano, who is at the International Monetary Fund. Given all the efforts to reach the poor, this is for both Miguel and for Santiago, there is still a huge population that has not been reached. We've talked a lot about breaching the digital divide. Do you have any concrete suggestions for how to aid these people that have been left out and have not yet been reached by these extraordinary measures? And then I'm afraid we're gonna have to end there. Santiago, why don't you?
Oh, thank you, Cynthia. For anything to be useful, it's going to be quick and dirty, it's going to be imperfect, and it's not going to work 100% well. But nobody can expect anything to work 100% well in the very, very, very short run. You have registries of remittances. Central banks and banks have registries of people who receive remittances. You know the names, you know the addresses, you have bank accounts. You can use all that infrastructure to make income transfers. Some informal firms and some informal workers are actually registered with the tax authorities in very special small tax regimes. You have names, you have addresses, you have bank connections, you can use that. Some countries actually provide health services to informal workers. You have registries of the households, you have registries of the names of the people, you know where they live. So you can do a quick and dirty combination. And if maybe you end up reaching 60 or 70% of the population that you wanted to reach over the next 2 months, that's better than doing nothing. Surely 30% should be reached as well. And maybe down the road, 2-3 months from now, you can improve your mechanisms. But you've got to start with whatever you've got. And speed is of the essence here.
Thanks. Miguel, any other additional comments about how to get to people that have not been reached despite the efforts?
No, this is very complicated, because if we had actually had progress with financial inclusion, then that would have actually been the solution. But I think we must take into account that almost 100%, in the case of Peru, 95% of population have cell phones. And there are applications, you know, the bandpipe in the US, they're developed. So I don't know whether we have the time to do that, but I think there is an opportunity to be able to increase coverage and access through, you know, IT devices, apps, you know, use the technology to be able to reach as many people as we can. So far, it's been perfect, but I agree with Santiago. You know, we have no time to make, you know, improve things. We have to display everything we can, all means we can. And the only caution is that when we're doing all these cash transfers or these transfers, people need to go to a bank. And that means having a lot of people together. And that goes against the spirit of a quarantine, of the social distancing. So, you know, the way that these policies are being pursued must be mindful of the collateral damage that we can face, given that we're still in the middle of a very, very severe pandemic.
Well, I think that basically does it. I want to thank Santiago, Miguel, Nora, Sebastian, who had to jump off earlier, for joining us for this very important discussion. The summary, the audio and the video will be on our website. We'll also be producing a short summary that we'll post on the web. So I thank you all for adding your very concrete suggestions as well as analysis to this critical issue for the region at this time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.